A tranquil forest in the Eifel region of Western Germany. A forest that harbors a dark past, with a legacy still visible in isolated places. From a time when it was dubbed a green hell. In the closing stages of the Second World War, it was the scene of bloody fighting between US and German forces. The path to the Western Allies' advance from Belgium into Germany led straight through the forest around the village of Hürtgen. For locals, the battle is still a key part of their history.
It was while riding around here on my bike as a teenager that I really came into contact with the history of the Hürtgen Forest. I would suddenly come across ruins among the trees, massive concrete walls. When I asked my parents, they told me they were the remains of bunkers from the Second World War. And once you know what to look for in this wartime landscape, you can also see bomb craters, trenches, and foxholes. If you really take the time, you can find a lot of these World War II relics in the Hürtgen Forest.
For around 5 months, the forest was the scene of successive, bitterly fought battles between the American and German armies. Although the Americans had more troops and were better equipped, their attempt to drive the Germans out of the forest was a military disaster. Progress was slow and costly as they became bogged down in the treacherous terrain.
It was a nightmare. I don't think there can be a worse hell. It was awful. It was freezing, and these damn shells, they hit the top of the tree and came down in thousands of fragments that could kill anybody.
I was in combat there for 10 days. At the height of the battle, I was trembling for practically the entire 10 days. I knew I could die, of course, and I was terrified.
An estimated 25,000 American and German soldiers died in the forest.
To survive the Hürtgen Forest was a miracle. But here I am. I don't know how I survived.
The forest was a death trap for the US troops. They called it Hürtgen Forest after the small village that was at the heart of the fighting.
The battle in the Hürtgenwald was one of the longest and deadliest battles on German soil in the West. It left a lot of scars, not only on the inhabitants and their descendants, but also on the landscape itself, in the forest, and on local buildings.
For the German troops, the war was, in effect, already long lost.
Even the young soldiers, those who could reflect, didn't believe in victory. You just wanted to survive, to come home safe and sound.
But Nazi war propaganda portrayed a completely different picture.
An der Westgrenze haben unsere Truppen trotz schwerster Angriffe unter erheblichen Verlusten für den Feind ihre Stellungen behauptet.
Dass die Alliierten den Krieg gewinnen würden, konnte zu
By
diesem
then,
Zeitpunkt
everyone knew the Allies would win the war.
alles, was also hier im Hürtgenwald
Everything that
passiert
happened in the
ist, hat
Hürtgenwald meant just a minimal delay of the inevitable,
geringfügig verzögert und es hat eben dazu beigetragen,
and it indirectly contributed to the continuation of the murders in the concentration and extermination camps, and in the prisons and other places,
Lagern und in den Gefängnissen
until the very last second of the Third Reich.
Städten dieses Regimes weitergehen konnte.
Since D-Day in June 1944, the Western Allied troops had been advancing from Normandy through France and Belgium towards Germany. In the process, liberating Paris, Brussels, and Antwerp from Nazi occupation.
We were told to, or ordered to, take the ground that they were on and take it away from them, and that's how we advanced to win the war. We were the ones that were going to win, not them.
On September 11, 1944, the first U.S. divisions reached the Belgian-German border near Aachen, more than 3 months earlier than expected. One day later, the 3rd U.S. Armored Division crossed into Germany near the town of Hürtgen.
We just went through the town and went on the other side. Then we got into the real trouble with the first site of the Siegfried Line.
The Siegfried Line was the defensive wall built to secure Germany's western border.
We saw steel gates on the road and dragon's teeth, and it was the first dragon's teeth that we had seen.
Anti-tank obstacles were known as dragon's teeth. They accompanied a line of bunkers stretching over 600 kilometers from the Dutch border down to Switzerland. For Western Allied troops, a formidable obstacle.
Sie haben keine genaue Vorstellung, was sie am sogenannten
They had no
Westwall
precise idea
erwarten.
what to expect at the
Das heißt also,
Siegfried
je
Line.
näher man, dem eigentlichen
So the closer they got to the actual territory of the Third Reich, the more insecure they became, because they thought they would still face strongly fortified and heavily manned defensive positions.
Damit sitzen die Alliierten im Grunde genommen der Nazi.
The Allies had been taken in by the Nazi propaganda of the pre-war years. This went so far that the American military's films used excerpts from German propaganda films showing the Siegfried Line as an insurmountable object to explain to its troops what they were up against.
Als unüberwindliches Hindernis zeigen.
As many as 500,000 men worked as much as 20 hours a day to build 22,000 fortified positions on land.
We knew that the Germans had built the Siegfried Line and that they were hoping that that would stop us. That didn't happen. Because we broke through the Siegfried Line. We took a hell of a lot of casualties, but we did it. But we knew that the Siegfried Line was a bad place to go to.
Psychologically, the Siegfried Line was effective on both sides, but its military value in the actual fighting was very limited.
U.S. troops succeeded in breaking through the anti-tank barriers near Hürtgen. But on the other side, they met with stubborn resistance from German troops who were firmly dug in the bunkers and in the woods. James Cullen was wounded in the fighting near the village of Rott.
Oh, I got it. I got hit, and it was a tremendous blow. And I looked down and I saw the blood pouring out right where my heart was. And I said, God, am I going to die here in a lousy German field? Because it looked deadly.
A few weeks later, Colin's parents back home received the news that their son had been wounded in action after being hit by shrapnel. He was away from active duty for 2 months. With American troops progressing much faster than expected, supply lines were stretched, which in particular meant fuel shortages for tanks. The advance ground to a halt just behind the German border. That gave German forces time to rebuild their lines of defense. Until then, the Wehrmacht had only stationed isolated units in the Northern Eifel. Meanwhile, preparations were underway for the Volkssturm, old men and boys, the home guard for Germany's last-ditch defense. In a televised address, Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels called on his compatriots' determination.
Eher würden wir uns die Hände blutig arbeiten und würden wir bis zum letzten Atemzug kämpfen, ehe dass wir zuließen, dass der Feind das deutsche Land besetzte und uns seinen Willen aufzwängt.
As usual, Goebbels was lying, of course. He claimed that the enemy was not yet on German soil, although they were, and he tried to mobilize any remaining forces. It has to be said that the German population were all too happy to go along with that. They were tired of war and wanted it to be over. But they were also terrified of what the Allies would do to them if they came.
The Americans wanted to advance further into Germany and finally see the war ended. Their aim was to reach the Rhine and then the Ruhr industrial region. But ahead of them lay a dense forest, almost 10 kilometers wide, which blocked their path, the Hürtgenwald. In local villages, the war had been all too present for several months, especially due to the Allied air raids on cities like Aachen. The civilians sought refuge in air raid shelters.
There were constant air raid alerts. And one day we came out of the bunker, and 6 buildings had burned down during the night. The cattle were screaming, the pigs were screaming, the people were screaming. It was awful.
In September 1944, the villages were evacuated as the invading troops and the front line came ever closer.
One morning, our parents said, "We have to leave." The artillery shells were landing all around. We were the last ones left in Hascheid. My parents said, "This is too much. We're going to leave too."
Instead of going around the forest to the north, the American commanders decided to advance eastward, right through the middle, where they hoped German defenses would be weak. But they completely misjudged the terrain, with disastrous consequences. A first push in October 1944 ended after just 3 kilometers.
It's not as if forests are alien to Americans. It's always highly problematic for an army to fight in wooded terrain. Tanks can't just drive through forests and over large trees. First, you have to cut paths through them.
The ground was also littered with landmines, and the Americans ran into a chain of bunkers in the forest. This was where the Germans had dug themselves in. The Americans were able to destroy some of the bunkers. But after 10 days, the losses on both sides were so great that the fighting died down for a while. Shortly afterwards, American forces further north achieved a decisive breakthrough, taking Aachen on October 21st after fierce fighting. It was the first German city to fall into Allied hands. But this was of little help to the American soldiers in the nearby Hürtgenwald. As the autumn rains began, the weather was worsening from one day to the next. The U.S. troops were literally bogged down. Plans for a second advance had to be repeatedly delayed. As one GI later said, anyone who says he knows where he'd been in the forest is lying. On November 2nd, the Americans attacked the village of Vossenack, and from there they took the villages of Kommerscheid and Schmidt via the Kahl Valley. But once again, they underestimated the difficult terrain. Some of the hills they had to cross were 150 meters high.
Wenn Sie auf einer Höhenlage stehen,
when you reach the top of a hill, you immediately experience the phenomenon of looking over the landscape from one plateau to another. But you have no idea how deep and steep the valleys in between are.
The 28th U.S. Infantry Division reached the village of Schmidt relatively quickly, but then its supply lines were interrupted.
If you look at Vossenack and Schmidt, with the valley in between, the only link between them is a footpath that winds down into the valley and then up again on the other side. The Americans thought this path would be easy enough to drive and walk along, that they'd be able to move the necessary troops, vehicles, heavy weapons, and other supplies along it. Everything. But that was nonsense.
The remains of tank tracks are a stark reminder that the battle for Vossenack and Schmidt ended in disaster for the Americans. The invaders retreated in panic, only for German units to cut them off down in the valley. Tanks crashed down the slopes, and many soldiers collapsed from exhaustion. The battle in the Kahl Valley, which the Americans subsequently referred to as Death Valley, claimed countless lives on both sides. A few days after the defeat, General Dwight D. Eisenhower came to the Hürtgenwald to meet his troops on the ground and assess the situation. Neither the Allied Supreme Commander nor his officers had expected so many casualties. The mood was despondent. The autumn of 1944 remained unusually wet and cold, and the terrain became more and more impassable every day. The Americans' hopes for a quick victory were fading. They had already spent 2 months in the Hürtgenwald, the forest they had hoped to cross in just a few days. In mid-November 1944, the Americans launched a third offensive. This time, they tried to advance by going further north, passing through the villages of Kleinhau and Großhau, and then heading east. During the fighting, a 22-year-old Italian-American from Pennsylvania arrived in the Hürtgenwald. In his youth, he had hoped to become a photographer.
We were there, I would say, a month. A month in a war is a long time. The German artillery it just never stopped. They really bombed us.
The days followed the same pattern. It began with heavy artillery fire from the Americans. Then tanks were deployed, Sherman tanks, which advanced on a broad front. And then, of course, you could hear the shells and machine guns. That was the actual moment you realized there were other people nearby who were shooting at you.
Paul Verbeek was sent to the Hürtgenwald with other young recruits in mid-December, to lay anti-tank mines. The U.S. forces were constantly getting reinforced with more men and more vehicles and equipment. But they were not prepared for the extreme weather conditions in the Eifel. Whenever they got stuck in the forest, they dug in. But foxholes offered little protection against the German artillery and the cold onset of winter.
It would rain sometime, or the snow would melt, and the foxhole was always filled with water. It was the Argus C3. I was fortunate to have this camera with me, and if you look at my pictures, I have hundreds and hundreds of pictures of officers. I didn't take those because I liked it. I took them to make them happy so that they would give me freedom to take more pictures, you know. I tricked all of them. I used them like little boys.
Both the Germans and the Americans spent most of their nights in their foxholes in the woods, poorly protected from the cold and wet with makeshift tarpaulin shelters.
I transformed the nature around me into a dark room. I would ask 3 of my best friends to let me use the metal part of the helmet, and those became the trays for my dark room at night. I would mix my chemicals. Most GIs were all asleep. I was working because the dark room was only the night. The earth was the dark room, you see.
Tony Vaccaro took hundreds of photos in the Hürtgenwald, although he waited over 50 years before publishing a selection of them.
All I wanted to take was photographs, photographs, photographs. That's why I am here today, otherwise I would have gotten killed a long time ago.
Some of the fiercest fighting took place in a valley west of Kleinhau, in the heart of the forest. In mid-November, author Ernest Hemingway was witness to the bloody battles there. In his later novel, Across the River and Into the Trees, based on his experiences, he wrote, "It was a place where it was extremely difficult for a man to stay alive, even if all he did was be there." In December, Tony Vaccaro also photographed his comrades preparing for the Christmas season. Gift packages with canned food from home arrived for soldiers who had long since perished.
They began to give this food of dead GIs to the local people, to the Germans.
On December 16, 1944, 100 miles further south in the Ardennes, the Germans launched a final surprise offensive. Once again, the Allies were hard-pressed in this likewise heavily forested region and had to bring in reinforcements at short notice to stem the German advance, many from the
Even during the Battle of the Bulge, there was fighting here. But both the Wehrmacht and the Allies were very busy with the offensive further south. That meant there was a period of 2 or 3 weeks without any major combat.
Then the war returned to the Hürtgenwald. In the course of January 1945, the Americans managed to advance in the face of weakening German resistance. The defeat in the Ardennes counteroffensive had cost the defenders their last reserves.
I particularly remember the first time I saw the Americans as prisoners of war. I was amazed at how well fed they were. And they were clean and tidy, including their uniforms, while we were a lice-ridden, dirty rabble.
Once the Americans reached the Ruhr, not to be confused with the more famous similar-sounding valley further north, their way to the Rhine and Cologne was finally clear. The Germans tried to blow up the dams to flood the valley and halt the U.S. advance. But by now, the end of the war seemed to be fast approaching. In February 1945, U.S. troops liberated Soviet prisoners of war and forced laborers in the Arnoldsweiler concentration camp near Düren. Many were also held under inhuman conditions at a second camp near Hürtgenwald. Over 2,000 inmates of these camps were later buried at the Soviet War Cemetery in Simmerath. Most of them had died of hunger and maltreatment. Most of the towns and villages in the Hürtgenwald were barely recognizable after the fighting. The Allied troops pushed on, and within a few weeks had conquered the Rhineland and the industrial Ruhr Valley as they advanced towards Berlin. The evacuated residents now hoped to be able to return to their villages.
When the Americans passed through, one of them asked us where we were from. We said we were from Schmidt. He said he had fought there, and we shouldn't go back there because the whole place was in ruins and the village had been mined. But we said, we're going home.
The fighting in the Hürtgen Forest was over, but the war had left a trail of destruction, a ravaged landscape whose scars are still visible today. American soldiers began clearing the mines that were buried everywhere. German prisoners of war were forced to help them. But they could only remove a small number of the deadly devices.
Again and again, we'd hear this huge bang, and another person flew through the air. So many people lost their lives. And one little girl had been playing with a hand grenade. She thought it had perfume inside. The hand grenades had rings on them, and when you pulled them, you had to throw them away very quickly. The girl's hand was blown off.
A very central aspect of the post-war experiences of people living in the Eifel was that they actually had to rebuild their lives on a former battlefield. Children died because they played with munitions. It was dangerous to plow and cultivate the fields. It took decades to clear the most severely affected parts of the forest of ordnance, debris, and the dead who'd been left there.
It would take the forest decades to recover. At the same time, nearby towns had been destroyed by air raids. In September 1945, August Scholl returned home from the war.
After being demobilized, me and another guy arrived in Düren on a freight train from Bonn at the beginning of September. We looked at each other and I said, "Martin, is this really Düren?" "Sure," he said. "There's the signpost." It was a bit lopsided, but it said Düren. And then we looked across the old town. It was one big pile of rubble. You couldn't see a single building still standing. And the really depressing thing was this eerie silence.
He continued to his home village of Großhau on foot. It had been almost completely destroyed during the fighting. The locals resorted to scavenging amongst the wrecked American tanks.
The Americans left behind lots of canned food. Canned corned beef was one of the main meats. There were also soups and other kinds of meat. But these tins of corned beef were big enough to make a huge pot of soup for a large family. So temporarily, they helped us to get more or less enough to eat.
In the first summer after the war, large parts of the woods that had survived the fighting would suddenly catch fire. During the fighting, the Americans had used phosphorus in their ammunition, which ignited very easily in the heat.
Der Hürtgenwald bei Aachen zählt zu den meistgenannten und blutigsten Schlachtfeldern der letzten Kriegsphase. Dieser Wald des Todes, wie er von den Soldaten genannt wurde, ein Wald ohne Baumkronen, ohne Vogelnest, ohne Lebewesen, ist noch heute mit Stacheldraht umgeben. Denn hier war buchstäblich jeder Meter durch Minen verseucht. Eine deutsche Minensuchabteilung ist noch jetzt, 2 Jahre nach dem Waffenstillstand, damit beschäftigt, das Gelände wieder begehbar zu machen. Aber auch hier geht das Leben weiter. Der Bauer kann schon wieder ringsherum seine Felder bestellen, wenn auch die toten Bäume noch lange an die Schrecken des Krieges erinnern werden.
The locals repeatedly found the bodies of dead soldiers in the forest.
Some I buried myself. And I don't need to explain what half-rotten dead people look like. You have to take a deep breath, mentally too, when you do something like that.
The first war cemetery in the area was built in Vossenach several years after the war. Many of the dead were recovered by former German Army Captain Julius Erasmus, who dedicated the rest of his life to searching the forest for fallen soldiers.
Herr Erasmus, wie viele Menschen haben Sie geborgen?
Ich habe Tausende Tote gefunden und 1600 habe ich bis heute hier geborgen und hier beigesetzt, beziehungsweise mit geholfen beizusetzen. Gewiss, es war nicht immer ganz ungefährlich, was man hier machen musste. Aber da habe ich wenig nachgefragt. Mich hat nur der Gedanke an die Angehörigen wieder dazu gezwungen, rauszugehen, um den Angehörigen eine Gewissheit zu bringen, wo ihr Liebster eventuell zu finden ist, beziehungsweise wo er beigesetzt war.
The war cemetery in Vossenach became the last resting place for around 2,300 dead soldiers and a meeting place for veterans and relatives of the German fallen. Another war cemetery was set up a few kilometers away in neighboring Hürtgen in 1952. Nearly 3,000 soldiers are buried there, many of them in unmarked graves. Since the Americans did not want their soldiers buried in Germany, the former enemy, many were laid to rest in the Netherlands, Luxembourg, or Belgium, at the military cemetery of Henri-Chapelle, for example. It was not until 4 decades after the battle that the first group of American veterans returned to the Hürtgenwald, to the place where they had fought as young men.
Impossible for human existence. You can understand why it became the murky, as they call it, Hürtgen Forest.
The whole battle itself, like the man said this morning, it was futile, it was foolish, but the fact remains it was done to satisfy the whims of a few superior officers that thought it had to be done.
Well, I didn't enjoy it at the time. I don't mind being here now because none of you fellows are wearing uniforms. So it's okay as far as that's concerned, but it was pretty difficult.
The commemorative events sometimes brought together American and German veterans, former enemies. The battle also left its legacy in the forest itself. Over the subsequent years, bomb disposal experts have frequently been called in to remove bombs, hand grenades, and other ordnance. The dangers that lurk here will continue to affect future generations in the region. Even now, 75 years after the battle, the war is still present in the ground of the Hürtgen Forest.
Wir befinden uns hier auf einer Fläche.
This is an area that has obviously not been searched, like so many areas in the Hürtgenwald.
Wie so viele Flächen im Hürtgenwald.
Here you might still unearth a grenade by scratching away the topsoil. Sometimes these things don't look like munitions at all. For example, there's a German grenade that looks like a cigar. It's about the same size. But if it goes off, you're a goner.
In the first decades after the war, hundreds of tons of ordnance were found in the forest every year. This footage from 1984 shows the yield of a search lasting 2 weeks.
Man muss sich ja vorstellen,
you have to imagine that here, by noon in a single day, in a single attack, the Americans fired about 12,000 grenades. 12,000, not 1,200. Given the typical assumption that 15% of these are duds, then we have to assume that there are about 1,500 duds in an area of 3.5 to 4 hectares.
For a number of years now, historical researchers have been studying the Hürtgenwald using the latest scientific methods. They've been able to reconstruct the course of the battle in places where this wasn't previously possible.
When you walk through the woods here, you encounter signs of the battle at every turn. In all the open spaces, however, the former battlefield has been completely cleared. In other words, we always see half of the battlefield, and we can see that here. We're standing in what appears to be a completely level green field, with nothing to indicate that we're on a former battlefield. But in fact, we're in the middle of a highly fortified section of the German second line of defense.
Many local people have kept the memory of the battle alive. In addition to the German dead, thousands of Americans who had been sent to Europe to end the Nazi terror perished here, although this is by no means clear everywhere.
Take the memorial stones for American or German soldiers, for example. The way they are treated on equal terms is actually quite questionable. It ought to be made clear that the Americans were fighting for something very different than the German soldiers. But you find them dotted around the landscape without any commentary.
The forest is still frequented by people foraging around for relics of the battle. Even today, the area is a popular site among war enthusiasts. But many locals are annoyed by these groups of individuals in American uniforms repeatedly reenacting scenes from the battle.
Man spielt dann hier so ein bisschen Krieg nach.
It's kind of like replaying the war. Some people even dig new trenches here. So they don't leave this commemorative landscape as it was. Of course, they don't shoot at each other with live ammunition, but people still find it fascinating. I take a critical view, because there were so many fatalities here. Whether it's fun or not is beside the point.
Today, there are now signs for walkers and hikers in various places telling the story of the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest. They also remind us of its importance for the Western Allies' advance through Germany. But the Hürtgenwald will probably never be a normal forest again. Certainly not now, some 75 years after the battle.
Yeah, I went back to the Hürtgen Forest maybe 10 years ago. I cried like a baby because I suddenly remember my best friends that got killed in the Hürtgen Forest. It was ugly. Ugly for mankind to have wars. The trouble that mankind makes is that he thinks he's Italian, he's German, he's Spanish. We're all humans on this beautiful paradise is our earth. Beautiful.